My name is Michelle Murphy. I'm Research and Policy Analyst with Social Justice Ireland, and I would like to welcome you all to the launch of Social Justice Matters 2021 Guide to a Fairer Irish Society. This afternoon, my colleagues Dr. Sean Healy, Suzanne Rogers, Colette Bennett and myself will take you through the main policy areas covered in our annual socioeconomic review, give you an overview of some key issues and policy proposals for each chapter, and then we will wrap up with a question and answer session. So before I go any further, I just draw your attention to the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen there, so you can use it throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, put your questions in and we'll get to them then in the Q&A session. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Social Justice Ireland, we're an independent social justice think tank, website socialjustice.ie. We work to deliver and develop independent and credible social analysis to provide viable policy pathways forward to a sustainable future. Our goal is to influence the public debate to ensure that it focuses on what matters most to those who are poor or vulnerable or in need, and we work to improve public policy in order to improve society as a whole. In terms of Social Justice Matters 2021, it's our annual socioeconomic review. So it looks at the key long-term challenges facing Ireland and facing governments, looking at the trends, solutions, the evidence. We look at 10 key policy areas in particular. We provide in-depth and independent analysis and detailed policy proposals, and it's a key annual reference point on social justice and social policy issues. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Sean Healy, to begin the presentation of Social Justice Matters 2021.
Thanks, Michelle. 2020, the past year, was an extraordinary year. An unexpected pandemic provided us with sudden and immediate challenges. And interestingly enough, the response to them avoided the huge mistakes that government made in responding to the crash in 2008. This time round, the fiscal response was correct. The focus was on protecting jobs and services and ensuring a minimum standard of living could be maintained. Now, having experienced the impact of COVID-19 and with the vaccination program being rolled out, many are reflecting on what the future holds, what future we should be working for, what plans and approaches would be most likely to respond effectively to the challenges facing Ireland and the wider world at this crucial moment. Now, this reflection goes far beyond the immediate response to the pandemic about what we do the day after the lockdown finishes or whatever. Many believe that COVID-19 exposed weaknesses that already existed, while the response to COVID-19 showed that government could in fact expand and adjust as required to protect both society and the economy. In this context, it should also be noted that the burden of the lockdown has fallen particularly on parents, especially mothers. Many have struggled to work from home while simultaneously homeschooling their children. The closing of schools has put a generation of children at risk of emotional damage and educational disadvantage. And those with the least at the beginning of the lockdown are most likely to lose out the most. At particular risk are children in overcrowded homes without computers or fast broadband, children with additional needs as well. Now, they're just one example. There are many others that we could document. So what should our response be to this situation in which we find ourselves? Social Justice Ireland believes that Ireland needs a new policy framework that would be effective in addressing the inequalities, the poverty, the exclusions that proliferate across our country. A fairer future must be developed. That's why we are proposing the development of a new social contract. Earlier this year, just late last year, in our publication on the social contract, we called for a reboot of Ireland's social contract. The social contract is the general agreement among citizens and the state, between citizens and the state, about the principles and goals to collectively address their common challenges. So if you think about it this way, after the Great Depression and the Second World War, there was a new social contract became part of the reality in Western Europe, and we came to know that as the welfare state. It was created and implemented by political and academic elites at that time. In the last couple of decades of the 20th century, from the 1980s, early 80s on, globalization imposed a new social contract, which we have come to know as neoliberalism, led by multinational corporations and pro-business politicians. but that the neoliberalism social contract was favoured corporations and businesses most. Social Justice Ireland is suggesting that a new contract is required that would address the core challenges we're now facing as a society, and that real citizen engagement should be at the core of such a contract. Now, in this publication, Social Justice Ireland identifies many policy recommendations for a new social contract. These proposals are designed to deliver a thriving economy, decent infrastructure and services, just taxation, good governance, and sustainability. 5 things. These policies, as they're developed, must be worked on simultaneously, not one after the other. So if we are to stop the boom to bust sequence we've experienced in recent decades, we've got to address these issues simultaneously. It's not a question of getting the economy right and everything else will follow. These policies, if implemented, the policies we're suggesting, would deliver a fair recovery and improve the quality of life for all. We need the investment in infrastructure and services if we're going to have a thriving economy. But we also need just taxation to fund this whole process. We need good governance to ensure people have a say in shaping the decisions that impact on them. And we also need to ensure that everything that is done is sustainable environmentally, economically, and socially. So what we are looking at is the fact that change is necessary and that change is possible. In the past 6 decades, Ireland has had the welfare state that we talked about, followed by neoliberalism. Now, the weaknesses of neoliberalism are well documented at this point. Change is required. The social contract we are proposing here in this publication today should be Ireland's guiding vision in the years immediately ahead. To achieve that vision, a new social dialogue is required, where issues may be discussed in a deliberative manner. Social contract would be the vision, social dialogue would be the process. And this new social dialogue should involve government, trade unions and employers, the community and voluntary pillar, as well as farmers and the environmental pillar. Any structure for social dialogue that excludes any of these groups would be a recipe for ensuring that most of Ireland's resources would be captured by those participating in the discussion. Those not participating directly in it would be the losers in effect. Such an approach would simply lead to deepening divisions and growing inequality in Ireland. At the core of the new model of social dialogue is not the drive towards cost competitiveness, although that is incorporated through the wage bargaining process and productivity improvements and so on, but a broad-based enhancement of capabilities in the economy and society. These do not emerge spontaneously, however. The role of civil society, where community and voluntary sector are particularly important in Ireland, is critical in this process. Dialogue is the means by which different sectors could negotiate to agree on a future they wish to achieve and set out pathways towards reaching that destination and heal any disagreements and divisions in the process. As Ireland moves into a post-COVID world, it needs to cure the virus of social injustice, inequality, marginalisation, and environmental destruction. In its place, it needs a new social contract and a new social dialogue to facilitate movement towards that social contract. To do this, Social Justice Ireland's new social contract proposals would see government policy focused, as I've said already, on delivering 5 outcomes simultaneously: a vibrant economy, decent infrastructure and services, just taxation, good governance, and sustainability. This approach is not simply doable, it's also desirable, effective, and efficient. It's time for change. So, to continue this presentation, I hand you over to my colleague, Colette Bennett.
Thanks so much, Sean. So just looking in terms of the long-term challenges that face government, the challenges facing government aren't confined to the pandemic. And that was something that the Minister for Finance himself acknowledged yesterday in his address in relation to COVID and the euro for the Dublin Economics Workshop. Before COVID, we had a market-driven housing system, we had inequality, we had demographic changes that will lead to growing dependency ratio, an increase in pension spending, and greater demand for services and infrastructure. We had high rates of underemployment and low-paid employment, a 2-tiered healthcare system with access and treatment dependent on your ability to pay rather than your need. Climate change, on which Ireland is a self-professed laggard. the need for a just transition to deal with the challenges of climate change and to ensure that those who will be most adversely affected will be supported in their transition, and the decline of rural communities, which saw demographic shifts to an older population with greater risk of poverty and fewer amenities, public services and social outlets. Add to that the rise in unemployment brought about by this pandemic. It's currently at 25%, but the employment rate will reduce as we emerge from this crisis. Even with that, it's still likely to be twice the pre-pandemic rate. That's why we need a new social contract. So moving on to what that policy framework might look like, we put forward a series of proposals across 5 pillars, which, if delivered, as Sean said, simultaneously, could support the delivery of a new and fair social contract. We need that vibrant economy. We know we need to deal with the deficit and to do so in a sustainable way. We need to build a stable financial system that enables us to boost public investment, creating decent jobs and reducing inequality. We need decent services and infrastructure. We need to increase investment in both long-term infrastructure and the ongoing current expenditure of staffing, maintenance and upgrading. We need quality services so that no one is left behind. My colleagues and I will discuss in greater detail what those services might look like a bit later, but there needs to be supports for those who are furthest away from accessing these services. And we need to provide a minimum social floor. Part of that will be the development of quality universal basic services, but also of a universal basic income so that everyone has enough to live a life with dignity. Those services and infrastructure obviously need to be paid for. And we do that through the development of that vibrant economy that I just talked about, and by ensuring that the taxation we collect is just. We need to increase our overall tax take and broaden our tax base. And we need robust tax governance, particularly in the area of tax expenditures. We need good governance generally, open, transparent and accountable structures, real and meaningful social dialogue that goes beyond the labour, employer economic forum, trade unions and business representatives, but allows for all stakeholders to participate. And we need for that participation to be meaningful, leading to real deliberative democracy rather than mere tokenism. In all of this, we need sustainability. This is not confined to climate change and climate justice. It must go to the core of our systems and policies. There's no point in creating more jobs if you need 3 of them to scrape a living. Yes, we need climate justice, and yes, we need to protect the environment, but we also need more balanced regional development, something that Michelle will expand on a little bit later, but which will be even more necessary if the reports of households relocating from urban areas to more rural areas are to be believed. And we need a better system of measurement, a sustainable progress index that goes beyond the problematic measure of GDP and moves us towards well-being budgets for our society and greater accountability in respect of our environment. All 5 of these pillars, as Sean said, need to be worked on simultaneously. It's not a question of getting the economy right and everything else will follow. That hasn't worked. That approach has led us from boom to bust and boom to bust, and this must end. So how do we build that new social contract? Well, we need to start with the fundamentals. In rebuilding our economy, we must do so with a view to making it work for the good of society instead of actively acting against it. This will require new approaches to the world of work and a recognition of much of the work done in society that goes unpaid, under-recognised and undervalued. It will also require recognition that our tax and welfare systems are not fit for purpose in the 21st century. The time has come to set a minimum floor of income and services below which no one should fall. The social welfare system and the income tax credit system should be replaced by a universal basic income, which will be far more appropriate for today's economy. This should be accompanied by the development of universal basic services to secure the well-being of all. A new social contract will also require us to give climate action the priority it urgently needs. The response to COVID-19 shows that society can be mobilised quickly and effectively to address a real and present danger, and climate change represents such a danger, but the policies so far have been wholly inadequate. We now know that we can respond quickly and effectively to major threats. An effective response to climate change must figure prominently in our new social contract. Even at the earliest stages of this pandemic, the critical value of having an effective public sector was illustrated. The focus of recent decades on constantly reducing the role of the public sector and moving towards privatisation has been shown to be wrong. We cannot settle for a 2-tier healthcare system when this pandemic has passed. Ireland will emerge from the pandemic with a larger public sector, something acknowledged by the Minister for Finance yesterday. We must ensure that this change delivers the foundation of a new social contract, that everyone benefits from a larger public sector, and that these much needed services and infrastructure are adequately resourced going forward. So in terms then of funding a new social contract, setting aside the COVID-19 related expenditures, which will be ring-fenced for the next 2 years and beyond, it must be acknowledged that while this social contract we describe is eminently deliverable, it will obviously cost money. This requires an acknowledgement from government and from people that Ireland's current model of revenue generation doesn't provide the resources necessary to deliver the public services, the social infrastructure, or the income supports that Ireland actually needs in order to vindicate our rights. It's simply not possible to provide the high quality public services Irish people aspire to having while failing to collect adequate revenue to pay for them. As a policy objective, Ireland can remain a relatively low tax economy and still collect sufficient revenue to meet the economic, social and infrastructural requirements necessary to support our society and complete our convergence with the rest of Europe. Ireland can never hope to address its long-term deficits in these two areas if we continue to collect substantially less income than that's required by other European countries to stand still. If Ireland is to increase its total tax take, it must do so in a fair and equitable manner. We believe that the necessary extra revenue should be partly raised by increasing income taxes for those on highest incomes and partly by reforming the tax code, and I'll expand a little bit on that later on. Reforming governance and widening participation must remain a key goal. To secure a new social contract, participation by various sectors of society is essential. One component of real participation is the recognition that everyone should have the right to participate in shaping the society in which they live and the decisions that impact on them. Ireland needs real, regular and structured debate involving all stakeholders on an equal footing to ensure that all interest groups and all sectors of society can contribute to the discussion and the decision making on the kind of society Ireland wishes to actually build. So now I'm going to pass you on to Michelle.
Thanks, Colette. Now, so now we're going to start with the, I suppose, the policy issues. And the first of the policy issues, the book is income distribution. And I'm just going to look at one particular issue here. How can we set a minimum floor of income to address poverty and inequality? So despite improvements in poverty rates in recent years, we still face a challenge in terms of inequality, income distribution and poverty. Still have 12.8% of the population, or about 629,000 people living below the poverty line, of which 190,000 are children. And without the social welfare system, actually 4 in every 10 people in the Irish population will be living in poverty. So this shows us the heavy lifting that the social welfare system does in terms of moving people out of poverty, the importance of core social welfare rates, and the challenge of an unequal distribution of direct income. Now, we have seen progress in recent years in terms of poverty rates, and that's primarily down to increases in social welfare rates, which were very welcome and something which Social Justice Ireland has advocated for many years. Of concern is that the past 2 budgets, core welfare rates were left unchanged. So any progress we have seen will stall. And then on top of that, you have the impact of the pandemic, which will have a considerable impact on those who are already vulnerable and those who are worst off. In terms of policy solutions, then, we have the Roadmap for Social Inclusion, which the Oireachtas Committee is discussing today. I think you should set a goal of eliminating poverty in a single 5-year Dáil term. And in particular, you need to focus on the issue of social welfare payments and maintaining adequate levels of payments. So Social Justice Ireland would propose that we benchmark minimum social welfare rates. So the core rate to movements in average earnings. So you benchmark it against 27.5% of average weekly earnings. Now the difference between the two is the benchmark is 222 euros a week. The core social welfare rate is 203. So you have a shortfall of €19 to make up. We would propose that government could do this over 2 or 3 budgets. Once you reach your benchmark, then the goal is to index social welfare rates against the minimum essential budget standard and the minimum standard of living. If you do this, then you can reach your poverty targets. You can address the challenges of child poverty, family poverty, household poverty, and you can address the issues of very high numbers of people with a disability, for example, living in poverty, and the issue of the working poor, which Colette will discuss again in the employment section. But ultimately, if we are going to meet our poverty goals and address income distribution, income inequality, we do need to focus on core social welfare rates. And I'll hand back over to Colette now to look at taxation and employment.
Thank you very much, Michelle. So in terms of taxation, the core policy objective here is to collect sufficient taxes to ensure full participation in society for all through a fair taxation system in which those who have more pay more, while those who have less pay less. Sounds reasonable. Government decisions need to be linked to the demands on its resources. So those demands depend on what government is required to address, or they decide themselves to pursue. The effects of the economic crisis a decade ago and the way it was handled continue to carry significant implications for our future taxation needs. Similarly, the need for the state to rescue or support so many aspects of our economy and society during the current pandemic has triggered large-scale borrowing and further liabilities to both service and repay this debt. We believe that there is merit in developing a tax package which places less emphasis on taxing people and organisations on what they earn by their own useful work and enterprise, or on the value they add, or what they contribute to the common good. Rather, the tax that people and organisations should be required to pay should be based on the value that they subtract by their use of common resources. Whatever changes are made should also be guided by the need to build a fairer taxation system, one which adheres to our already stated core policy objective. Recent budgets have made a start on this, but there are a number of approaches available to government in reforming the tax base set out in the Taxation chapter of our publication being launched today. Suggestions that higher rates of taxation would hinder Ireland's competitiveness are not borne out in the various studies available, and that is something that needs to be made quite clear, because it is something that is levied every time we bring out these proposals. In order to create a more just taxation system, we need to move Ireland's overall level of taxation to reach a level equivalent to €15,000 per capita in 2017 terms. This target should increase then each year in line with growth in modified gross national income. This would still see us in the same position compared to per capita income or per capita taxation across the EU. We also need to make all discretionary tax reliefs or expenditures only available at the standard 20% rate. Support fair changes to income taxes. There should be no reduction in taxation. In fact, any future money should be used to improve our public services along the lines mentioned earlier, and that will be explored in greater detail later on. To introduce a system of refundable tax credits to support the working poor, to reform the tax system to support individualisation. The process of individualisation followed so far to date has been deeply flawed and unfair. The cost of the exchequer of this transition has been more than €750 million, and almost all of this money went to the highest income 30% of the population. A significantly fairer process would have been to introduce a basic income system. And finally, on this point, we need to make the taxation system simpler. Discriminatory tax concessions in favour of particular positions are often very inequitable, contributing far less to equality than might appear to be the case. Moving on then to work, and our core policy objective, here is to ensure that all people have access to meaningful work. So based on our calculations, we're looking at doubling of the pre-pandemic unemployment rate, a rate not seen since the height of the last crash. And in terms of the number of people, an additional 140,000 people unemployed post-pandemic, as many of the people currently being supported through the pandemic unemployment payment and the employee wage subsidy scheme have those payments tapered off and removed. We need to tackle underemployment. This is part-time workers who would like and are available to work more hours than they currently have. We've seen a loss of 6.6 million hours of work in 2020, predominantly in sectors dominated by women and low-paid workers. Even when business starts to recover, many workers will be returning to jobs on less hours than they would have had previously. In terms of long-term unemployment, an issue that was there before the pandemic will remain, and we need to ensure that there are tailored measures to support the long-term unemployed that are separate to those 140,000 people or so more recently unemployed, and which are unlikely to return to employment as recovery begins. We need to have much more tailored and measured approaches. We know that youth unemployment has been a particular feature of this pandemic, again, given the sectors that are most affected. We've made recent improvements on our rate of those not in employment, education or training, and this effort needs to be ramped up to support the newly unemployed youth and prevent a long-term youth unemployment crisis. In terms of policy proposals, government could start by acknowledging that work is not synonymous with paid employment. Many unpaid carers, those predominantly women who work in the home, volunteers, have provided essential work during this pandemic and need to be recognised for the value that they provide. We need to invest in infrastructure programmes that focus on the social good, local and regional construction and development projects for housing, which will bring much needed money into the local and regional economies and have the capacity to provide housing within communities for the whole of the life cycle. From family homes to student accommodations to first-time homes to smaller homes for older people who may wish to downsize without leaving their communities and their support systems behind. Other infrastructure projects too, such as schools, community health networks, playgrounds, they all contribute to the well-being of the local inhabitants while creating jobs and stimulating local economies. As mentioned earlier, we need to address the worrying level of youth unemployment and develop policies and programmes to support young workers in the aftermath of the pandemic. And we need to resource upskilling more generally, not only to tackle the recently unemployed, but to retrain and reskill workers in sectors at risk from globalisation and climate change initiatives. And now I'm going to move on to Suzanne Rogers.
Thanks, Colette. We're going to look at the housing system now. Housing is the most fundamental of our needs. Without a home, development and growth are put on hold. Participation and community engagement are difficult to imagine. Other rights have to wait. We must ensure that adequate and appropriate accommodation is available for all people, and we must develop an equitable system for allocating resources within the housing sector. Households are being simply priced out of both rental and retail housing markets. To rent or buy is difficult, if not impossible, for households either on a single or an average wage. There has to be more state investment in social and affordable, and I mean truly affordable housing, and a cost rental model should be introduced as an affordable rental model. The over-reliance on the private sector to deliver social housing has proved to be both expensive and inefficient. The economic demands of the market in the form of banks and landlords are in direct conflict with the social and community housing needs of the individual. Many simply need more housing than they can afford at market rates. We must deliver more social housing. Currently in Ireland, social housing counts for just 9% of all housing, compared to some of our peers across Europe who have 20% social housing. We should be aiming for this target as a way of ensuring that all have access to affordable housing. This lack of social housing and the reliance on the market to deliver a public good has resulted in the increase in homelessness witnessed over the last decade and more, and in particular family homelessness. The figures for January 2021 are stark. 5,987 homeless adults. 126 of them are over the age of 65. No one should be retiring into homelessness. There are still 966 families with 2,026 children. Homelessness is still a major issue, and it requires an intersectional, cross-departmental approach. The housing first approach works, and it must be extended to families who need it. Families cannot function as families whilst in hubs, hotels and bed and breakfasts. Children have nowhere to play, nowhere to do their homework, they've nowhere to make noise, they've nowhere to mess, they've nowhere to fight, they've nowhere to storm off to in a sulk when everybody lives in the same room. Time limits must be placed on family stays and emergency accommodation to limit this damage. At the end of December 2020, there were 543 children who have been without a home of their own for over 2 years. Children and families are at risk of becoming institutionalised. Children's social, physical, emotional and educational development are all delayed whilst without a home space. They must be a priority for government at every level to ensure that they are really and truly the last generation to be forced to live like this. Rebuilding Ireland 2016 to 21 is almost at an end. It's unlikely to deliver on its build targets. We must rethink now how we deliver housing and ensure that the public good is placed before private profits. I'll pass back to Colette for the next section. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Firstly, in relation to health, many of you will all know this already, but essentially health is not just about health care. The link between poverty and ill health is well established by international and national research. People with low incomes are less likely to see a doctor because access to preventative services is concentrated among the better off. One of the most obvious concerns about the Irish healthcare system is about access. Ireland's health system ranked 22nd out of 35 countries in the 2019 Health Consumer Powerhouse report. But on the issue of accessibility, Ireland ranked the worst. That report notes that even if we had a waiting list, we reached our waiting list target of 18 months, it still would be the worst time situation in Europe. Pre-pandemic, Irish hospitals were working at almost full capacity. The occupancy rate for acute care hospital beds is among the highest in the OECD countries, and it's 20 percentage points higher than the OECD average. Also, by comparison with other OECD countries, the share of the Irish population delaying or going without care is also comparatively high, above 30%. There are also barriers in access to primary care, delays in accident and emergency department admissions, and high waiting times for access to hospital care in the public system. In terms of access, those who are poor and sick without medical cards fare worst. In 2017, almost 1 in 3 households where at least one person had a medical examination or treatment in the last 12 months reported that costs were a financial burden. For households with children, the corresponding rate was higher at over 35%. Moving to COVID, and we can't talk healthcare without it, the new COVID GeoHive site is really interesting. The impact of COVID-19 has not been immune to the disparities between socioeconomic groups. So taking a point in time, as of the 10th of March 2021, the 14-day national incidence rate of COVID-19 was 201.2 per 100,000 people. But as we know, not all areas are created equally. COVID-19 infection rates are up to 50% or more higher in disadvantaged areas compared to more affluent areas. Take Dublin as an example, a county with a range of socioeconomic profiles. While the national incident rate was 201.2 per 100,000 people, this compares to 163.1 in Blackrock, 144.2 in Dundrum, 165.7 in Howth Malahide, and 122.5 in Dunleary. Moving north of the border, we go North Inner City has a rate of 415, more than twice the national rate. Ballymun-Finglas is more than 2.5 times the national rate with 523.5, and so it goes for similar areas. These numbers are stark and they reveal the impact of poverty, of a lack of service provision and a lack of safe employment, and clearly debunk the myth that COVID-19 was a great leveller. The pandemic has created many issues, but it also provides an opportunity for government to finally grasp the nettle of healthcare inequality, to address our two-tiered system and to invest in primary care, community healthcare networks and statutory rights to home care. To allow people to age well at home and create the environment within communities has been proven to have a positive impact on all of these issues that I spoke about just earlier on. It also frees up our spaces in acute hospitals for those who actually need acute care and can reduce our capacity rate below that 95%. Government needs to continue to properly fund Sláinte Care, including the 500 million investment in infrastructure that was committed to every year for the first 6 years, and we welcomed the measures in that regard in Budget 2021. We need more GPs and community healthcare teams. We need to properly address the waiting lists, particularly for mental health supports in the years beyond this pandemic. I'm going to hand you back now to Michelle.
Thanks, Colette. So I'm just going to look at education now, educational disadvantage. And I suppose particularly I just want to look at the issue of addressing the impact of lost learning on students in the past 12 months. So we know that there's been an impact on students at all levels, but it will be felt most by those students who are most disadvantaged. I mean, Ireland already has an achievement gap between pupils from disadvantaged areas and their peers, and we have been making progress. It has stalled since 2012, but the pandemic is likely to reverse many of the gains that we have made. In addition to this, students are facing long-term losses in income as a result of the interruption in learning. You're looking around 3% for students as a whole, but the loss will be greater for those students from disadvantaged areas. This was a challenge in Ireland prior to COVID. Even if you looked at those who graduated from From higher education, those graduates from more affluent areas earned around €2,000 more a year on average than their peers in the same course from disadvantaged areas. And even when you do control from different factors, graduates from disadvantaged backgrounds earn on average about €600 less after graduation than their peers. So we can see that we had a challenge with disadvantage and educational attainment prior to COVID, and the impact of the past 12 months will simply exacerbate that. So what are the policy proposals available to us? Well, as a start, we should make the improvement of educational outcomes for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds and communities a policy priority, looking at what additional resources are needed in terms of addressing persistent disadvantage. In particular, looking at the demographic changes coming down the line at primary, second level in particular, how we can adjust in terms of reducing our class sizes and pupil-teacher ratio, how we adapt our curriculum to make it fit for purpose, not just fit for purpose for a technological change, but equipping young people with the ability to think critically and analytically, to make decisions and apply their skills creatively and adapt to change. And particularly then going beyond just those in our schooling system, but looking at education and training as a whole and meeting the changes that we are going to face in terms of just transition and digitization. We have to look at our skills and our lifelong learning and looking at having a sustainable and appropriately funded education system that takes a life cycle approach from early childhood right through to adulthood. Now I'm going to pass back to Suzanne to look at participation.
Thanks, Michelle. There's a lack of social dialogue. We've already heard about a need for social dialogue at a national level. However, our communities at a local level also need to have a more central role in the development of policies that affect them. We ask that the public participation networks are adequately resourced and that social dialogue is promoted at a local level. Community and citizen engagement is vital in the formation of policy responses to the issues and problems that impact our daily lives. By fostering an environment of inclusion and empowerment, local people and local authorities can work together to improve their communities for all. This engagement is critical as Ireland strives to implement the Sustainable Development Goals and well-being at a local and regional level. We need to ensure that all people from different cultures are well welcomed in a way that's consistent with our history, our economic status, and our obligations as world citizens. We need to ensure that every person has a genuine voice in shaping the decisions that affect them, and that every person can contribute to the development of their society. The Programme for Government 2020 made a commitment to ending the system of direct provision for those in the international protection process. We welcome the publication of the white paper and urge government to meet the targets within. Those who choose to make Ireland their home must be allowed to participate fully. The transformational power of education benefits everybody, and we ask that investment be made in skills transfer programmes for immigrants into Ireland. The participation of immigrants in all aspects of economic, cultural and social life in Ireland must be encouraged. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the inequalities in our society, especially for those living in overcrowded conditions for whom maintaining safe distances from other households and having somewhere safe to isolate was an impossibility. 2020 was the first year since 2014 that the full traveller housing budget was drawn down by local authorities, spending 15 million of the 14.5 million allocation, the largest spend in decades. We call on government to ensure funding for traveller-specific initiatives and to implement the recommendations of the Shannon Committee report on travellers. Irish society has changed significantly over the last 50 years. We are moving more towards urban living and more of us are better educated. We are having fewer babies and we are living longer, and many of us were born elsewhere. Our services must adapt to reflect and support these changes to our demographics. Housing planning must ensure that we can age well within our chosen communities. Childcare must be affordable and accessible to encourage and support working parents, and particularly women in the workplace. Good quality, reliable, affordable broadband is more important than ever before, ensuring that households can access information, work, education, banking, groceries, and remain connected to their social networks. Transport links must be reliable and affordable. Every citizen must be afforded the means to flourish and engage in a meaningful way in our society. Therefore, we must implement the national strategies for the community and voluntary sector to fully realise the goal of full participation. Thank you. I'm going to pass you back to Michelle.
Thanks, Suzanne. Now, looking at sustainability and the environment, looking at how we promote the sustainability agenda and meet our climate targets in a fair way, I suppose, particularly today, given the Climate Action Bill. So we all know the challenges that we face. We're not on track to meet our 2020 targets, despite the slowdown as a result of the pandemic, and neither are we on track to meet our 2030 targets. Difficult decisions regarding emissions reductions have been consistently delayed by consecutive governments, which makes implementing new policies even more challenging. However, something we can't ignore is that there must be sectoral change. It's not just down to the individual or to communities. We have to look at how each sector can contribute in order so that we meet our national ambitions, we meet our targets, and we do this in a fair way. So first off, we need to look at our taxation system, for example. There's incoherence there. We're subsidising activities that are harmful environmentally and fossil fuel activities, while at the same time we're looking at how we adapt our taxation system to promote environmentally friendly activities. There's certainly additional budgetary space for our government when looking at climate policy to focus on these subsidies in particular and remove those which are damaging, and use this revenue towards meeting, for example, retrofitting targets, towards reducing food waste, and towards promoting a circular economy. We should be setting ambitious emissions reductions targets. I know some of those will be outlined in the bill today, but we have to ensure that sufficient resources are provided to support the implementation of these targets, and it's implementation here that is key, and meeting our national ambition. Continued support for certain sectors should be contingent on stronger conditionality. For example, if this is coming via the new Common Agricultural Policy, there's going to be a much stronger focus on sustainable agricultural practices. We have to see how that translates here in terms of short supply chains for farmers and consumers, better prices for farmers, but a more sustainable agricultural policy, so we don't have emissions increasing in one sector while our national target is to reduce them. And finally, we should be implementing a sustainable development framework into economic policy so that all decision made are sustainable environmentally, economically, and socially. And it's only in that way that we will have a truly just transition, which doesn't leave anybody behind and which invests in those social priorities that will enable and support those people and communities and sectors to make that transition in transforming how our economy and our society operates. And actually, this leads me on then to the issue of rural Ireland and how do we ensure that rural Ireland is not left behind, not just in context of the pandemic or Brexit, but the challenge of climate change and a digital transition. So we know the challenges that rural and regional policies face in terms of higher poverty rates, lower median incomes, higher dependency ratios, greater difference from everyday services, and a higher rate of part-time employment. These all existed prior to COVID. The challenge is the impact on COVID on rural areas. It will be significant and lasting because many of the drivers of the rural economy now, having moved from being primarily agricultural, are more diverse, but there are those sectors such as accommodation, hospitality, food and services, which have been had a devastating impact as a result of COVID, and they will be very slow to reopen. So we need to look at how we're going to support rural Ireland to contribute to our recovery, how we take advantage of the possibilities that remote working presents us in terms of offering people career progression, a better quality of life. But we have to invest in things like the remote working hubs beyond to ensure that we can make this a possibility for people. So in terms of policy then, where the new rural development policy is yet to be published, we look forward to seeing it, but we have to make our public investment choices that are balanced. They need to be linked to assessment of regional or local characteristics, looking at, what is the local labour supply? What are the food chains? What are the local services that are available in a particular area? How can we build on those? What is the skill sets? So how can we implement local policies that can adapt to local issues? It requires resourcing. We need the political will, obviously, but we need to put the money into these communities. We need to roll out broadband as quickly as possible, reliable broadband. We need to promote integrated spatial planning. We need to connect rural people, SMEs and micro enterprises with skills and lifelong educational training opportunities. And Ultimately, we need to ensure that we can involve all stakeholders in a transition around the changes that are coming, but ensure that rural areas have the institutional capacity and good governance to respond to this discussion and to fulfil their roles in terms of delivering a high quality of life for residents and vibrant rural communities, not just for the current generation, but for future generations. I'm going to pass over to Colette now to look at the global south and global development.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Excuse me. So essentially our goal here is to ensure that Ireland plays an active and effective part in promoting sustainable development in the global south, and to ensure that all of Ireland's policies are consistent with that development. So today, for example, average life expectancy is 20 years higher for people in the richest countries compared to those in sub-Saharan Africa. The UN reports that almost 1 in 3 adults in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa are unable to read. These inequalities are also reflected in the sizable differences in income levels and in mortality rates. Less developed countries are generally more affected by climate change than industrialized countries. Heatwave fueled droughts are being felt first and foremost in developing countries. However, those countries most at risk of heatwaves are most underrepresented in the research. The effects of climate change have increased the vulnerability of many communities, leading to enforced migration, internal displacement, poverty, hunger, and even death. Food production is a huge challenge for communities who are constantly forced to move. This is why overseas development assistance is so important. The United Nations agreed target for developed countries like Ireland is to provide 0.7% of national income in development aid. While welcome increases have been made in respect of Ireland's ODA contribution recently, the shortfalls during the austerity years have still not been regained. This limits the resources available for tackling extreme poverty, tackling hunger and human rights abuses. This funding is needed now more than ever as developing countries attempt to get to grips with COVID-19 and see themselves last in the line for vaccines and the resultant economic disruption. Budget 2021 allocated 837 million in overseas aid, so 0.42% of modified gross national income. Reaching the UN goal of 0.7% in the years ahead will require increased effort. Our own national recovery from this pandemic should not interfere with our international obligations, particularly to those who are most vulnerable to global shocks, such as a pandemic and climate change. Ireland still lacks a strategy for reaching the UN target, a missed opportunity in the publication of the Better World, Ireland's policy for international development in February 2019. Further policies also need to be developed and adopted to respond to the current challenges being experienced by the global south, such as taking far more proactive stances at government level on ensuring that Ireland and EU policies towards countries in the global south are just, ensuring that businesses operating in developing countries, in particular Irish aid country partners, are subject to proper scrutiny and engage in sustainable development practices, playing a prominent role in the support and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, continuing to support the international campaign for the liberation of the poorest nations from the burden of the backlog of unpayable debt, working for changes in the existing international trading regimes to encourage fairer and sustainable forms of trade, and taking a leadership position within Europe and broader international arenas to encourage other states to fund programs and research aimed at taking a person-centered approach to the HIV and AIDS crisis. And I'm going to now hand you back over to Sean.
Thanks, Colette. And as we bring this presentation to a resolution, if you like, and start to look at questions and things that need to be addressed, I just point out we have a quotation at the end of last year's edition, the last edition of Social Justice Matters, from an unlikely source, maybe coming, people might think coming from Social Justice Ireland, but from Milton Friedman. Back in 1982, he said, or he wrote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. Our basic function is to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable." Now, I would say how very apt, given the year that we've just had. I'd also say that a lot of what we have been setting out in this presentation, published today as Social Justice Matters 2021, what we would be saying is that maybe there's quite a lot of things in there that might until recently have been seen as politically impossible, but are now becoming politically inevitable. The design and implementation of a recovery after the COVID-19 crisis will reshape our society and economy for future generations. It's important that we get these decisions right. Ireland's economic growth in recent years has been spread very unevenly. We can reverse that trend, and we can improve our well-being and living standards if we take this opportunity to implement real change. As Ireland moves into a post-COVID world, it needs to cure the virus of social injustice, of inequality, marginalisation, and environmental destruction. In its place, Ireland needs a new social contract. A new social contract is not simply doable, it's also desirable, effective, and efficient. It's time for change. I hand back to Michelle.
Thank you, Sean and Colette and Suzanne, and thank you everyone. As I mentioned, and as Sean mentioned, the Q&A function is there, and also we have some items in the chat function as well. But first of all, I will go to a question in the Q&A from Alex Piggott. I'll pass it over to Colette, looking at some examples of tax increases that you propose. So, for example, increasing the rate of tax paid on rentier income as opposed to PAYE, looking at site value tax, Tobin taxes, or taxing public sector employee pensions.
You're muted.
I'm mute, of course, sorry. Thanks very much, Alex. And I can actually kill two birds with one stone in this one, because there's also a similar question in relation to our tax proposals from Dr. Aidan Kenny in the chat function in relation to what changes to taxation are needed to support the provision of quality home units for all and to stop homelessness. You know, I think in terms of taxation proposals overall, we have a series of them. So as I said, you know, we need to look at things like increasing the overall tax rate, broadening the tax base, and making the system fairer. So increasing the overall tax take, for example, we need to move towards a tax take that puts us more in line with average European levels. So I had mentioned that figure of 15,000 per capita at 2017 rates. So that's really the level of collection we're looking at. But in terms of how we go about that, or how we certainly would propose to go about that, you know, we need to look at reforming that whole area around tax expenditures. So when we reviewed the data on 2018 tax expenditures, the discretionary expenditures account for 15.8 billion. So that is a huge pot of money that's not being properly scrutinized under the budgetary process, and that needs to actually be brought within those processes, be brought into within those kind of annual review processes. And there's a great amount of work being done by the Parliamentary Budget Office and by the Oireachtas Oversight Committee, but more is needed in relation to looking at kind of sunset clauses, looking at the usefulness of these expenditures. Where are they actually going? Who are they benefiting? And what could we do with them if we were collecting that money rather than foregoing it? In terms then of, you know, increasing the minimum effective tax rates on higher earners, so those with incomes in excess of 125,000, so that those rates are consistent with the level faced by PAYE workers. We'd move to negotiate the EU-wide agreement on the minimum corporate tax rates, adopt policies to ensure that corporations are paying a minimum effective corporate tax rate of 10%, but as an interim measure, introduce a 6% rate for the next budget, for budget 2022. Impose charges so that those who construct or purchase second homes pay the full infrastructural costs on those dwellings. And we would also propose reintroducing the non-principal private residence tax at a rate of €500 per annum, and a vacant homes tax at a rate of €200 per annum. Restoring the 80% windfall gains tax on the profits generated from land rezonings, and certainly in relation to Aidan's question, that is something that could potentially be ring-fenced to look at, you know, generating the income that is required to build homes on state lands, the type of thing that Suzanne mentioned in her presentation. In terms of then financial transaction taxes, we should join with other EU member states to adopt a financial transactions tax. and really discourage this market speculation, and adopt policies generally which further shift the burden of taxation from income tax to eco taxes and the consumption of fuel and fertilizers and waste taxes and rent taxes. And in doing so, government could minimize any negative impact on people with low incomes by introducing systems that deal with that type of hardship, that financial hardship. So that's those two questions hopefully answered.
Thanks, Colette. And there is just I'll address briefly the issue about the high quality public funded education and training system from Dr. Aidan Kenny, and also the digital divide. I suppose we're still, no matter what way we look at it, there's increased government funding is going to be required, particularly in terms of higher education. I mean, we're still awaiting the report from the European Commission on their economic evaluation of the funding options. In the Castle's report, it is expected in Q1 this year, and at that point then decisions are going to have to be made. We've kind of, I suppose, it's been pushed down the road, that decision, but either way you look at it, increased resources and increased public money will be required. And in terms of the digital divide then, in terms of COVID-19, I suppose that came out in the research that I suppose COVID-19 sort of pushed online learning on to us, and it showed the benefits, but it also showed the things that online learning cannot do, and the challenges that it still faces. So, but in terms of the digital divide for households, for children, for younger people, but also in terms of learning, the input of a skilled practitioner, a teacher, or a lecturer, and learning from your peers and learning from each other, that cannot be replicated by online learning. Online learning certainly has a role to play, but I think that what we see now is how are we going to integrate it into our system going forward? What sort of infrastructural changes need to be made so that everyone has, decent access to broadband, to ICT, etc. But also, what do we value about the other learning systems that we have, and how do we combine them? And there is an issue there. There's a couple of things coming through.
I can just actually pop in on the employer's contribution as well, just in relation to their actual financial contribution. Obviously, there was a move made in budget 2018 to increase the levy in relation to the National Training Fund. But where employers can actually play a really significant role is in the provision of in-work training, particularly for those who are employers of unskilled or lower skilled employees. It's in order for them to actually access opportunities to grow and to develop as businesses grow and develop in response to things like automation and globalization.
Yeah, and I mean that's been shown, and it'll be in the education chapter of Social Justice Matters, that actually you get the greater return by skilling lower skilled workers, particularly at a regional level. That's why it's so important to support those employers to invest in skills. There's a note from Jerry Brady regarding the 2019 fossil fuel subsidies, which are going to be released in the next 1 to 2 weeks. And I suppose he makes a point that we have made consistently. As you move towards eco taxes and having the cost of, I suppose, emissions within the taxation systems, you will see decreases from excises and road fuel taxes. But at the same time, you are going to have to invest in the infrastructure for electric vehicles, for example. So we need to look at how we readjust our tax system to deal with this changing reality. Now, Sean, there's a question in the...
I'll come back to that one, just to finish the one that Jerry Brady is because I think that's a very important issue in terms of the public debate, that there will be people basically saying, oh, well, we're going to lose all this, so we can't, we're going to lose all this income that we would have been getting from fossil fuels and so on, and we're going to have to sort of cut back, rather than facing what we've been outlining here, and which several of us have been presenting earlier in our presentations, which is basically that as a society, we need to face the fact that there needs to be a further shift in the burden of taxation away from income tax to eco taxes and consumption of fuels and fertilizers and waste taxes and site value tax and the Tobin tax that somebody suggested, and so on, and the various taxes that have been suggested by Colette in her piece, and yourself as well, Michelle. There's a fundamental piece here that needs to be grasped, which is that overall we have to broaden the tax base and increase the tax take. and that's going to have to be done on a moving platform, if you like, because we're going to be losing income from a number of different sources. If we're going to go the right route, we'll say on the COP commitments and all that we're supposed to be doing, including even meeting the commitments on the bill that's going through the Dáil today, or going into the Oireachtas today. I'll come back to the point that you were directing to me too, which was Sheila Cronin's question. Is it about something about Brexit? I think the critical issue is to coin a phrase that Brexit hasn't gone away. Like the reality is that Brexit is going to be affecting us for quite a while. Part of the issue that we have to face up to, I suppose, is that there are two completely different levels to this. There's the kind of level of what arrangements need to be made, and kind of the markets and the tax and the border taxes and all that sort of stuff. But then there's this political level as well, which is figuring more and more. And I think we're looking at seeing a situation at the moment where people like Lord Frost, who's leading on the British side, seems to me to be working towards a situation where he's trying to collapse almost everything that has been agreed, to try to force a new discussion, maybe even up to a substantially changed agreement, Brexit agreement. The reason for that, because they are beginning, they're not fools, they can see quite clearly that the impact of Brexit is a lot more than was sold to the public. It carries a lot more pain than was actually communicated in advance of either the ballot on it or in the discussion subsequently until it was agreed. So there's kind of those two dimensions. Ireland then has this other dimension, which is the border and the Irish Sea question with inverted commas. And I think that we have to be very careful that we don't wind up reimposing a border within the country. So to make that happen, I think we have to be engaging right across the system. And I think that's one of the reasons that there's it's important to try to engage with all points of view in Northern Ireland, particularly on what the future there may be. Because I think that a lot of what's happening since the arrival of Brexit is not really necessarily tied to the actual, is not an actual necessary outcome of Brexit, but the decisions of suppliers and so on not to continue with contracts that they had, or not to renew them, or to delay them, or whatever the story may be. Or maybe they just weren't ready in the first place. So I think we need to be careful about what's going on there. But it's going to be a huge challenge, and it'll become more so, or more obvious to us, I think, as a society, and maybe to the British too, once the COVID pandemic recedes, as it will at some point, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but whenever. But when it does recede, we're going to see Brexit much bigger than it maybe is figuring in a lot of people's consciousness at the moment. Critical issue.
Thanks, Sean. Now, Suzanne, there's a question here I might direct towards you, looking at changes to the tax system that are needed to support the provision of quality home units for all and to stop homelessness. So I know you mentioned site value tax there in your proposal, but you might go into a bit more detail.
I suppose a lot of that's probably been covered off in the, I mean, your tax take is your tax take, you know, that kind of thing. So I suppose anything to do with increasing tax, I think Colette and yourself and Sean have probably already kind of covered off, you know, as Sean said, like, you know, we need to increase our tax take and we need to broaden our tax base. And then, like every resource that's scarce, it'll be a question of how you actually allocate it. So I don't think I need to go back over the tax side of it. I mean, in terms of building social housing, I mean, we can't afford not to, you know, really is the answer to that. I think the money is being spent on homelessness provision, on emergency accommodation. I mean, the figures there, they're all in the book. There's startling amounts of money being spent on cure when prevention, as everybody knows, is really the way to go. So I think, yeah, I mean, in terms of tax take, I think it's the same. It's the same, I suppose, the issues that would crop up, and then where you spend that money then is a separate thing.
Thanks, Suzanne. Now, Sean, there's an issue here from Stephanie McDermott. I think she's had to leave, but the issue about how marginal communities are really suffering at the moment. I suppose going to the issue then of social dialogue and making sure everyone's voices are heard, and the value of the community and voluntary sector. You might comment on that.
I think the critical issue here is that there is a need for a new social contract. I think any analysis that is comprehensive of Ireland today and looks at the actual evidence recognises that we've been facing, not just in the last 12 months, a whole series of quite serious challenges for quite some time. And we have not been doing that well about it. And both Colette and myself mentioned this thing about, you know, from boom to bust to boom to bust, and we have to stop it. Michelle, you talked about the poverty levels and the fact that so many kids are in households with incomes below the poverty line. Suzanne talked about homelessness and families living in a single room and the kind of implications of that for the long term. Like, these are issues that were there before COVID. People see that now. We have an opportunity to do something about it. We have a recognition as well, for the first time in quite a while, that the government actually, as an agency, has the capacity to make serious difference when it chooses to do so. And while there was a lot of putting down of government and a lot of disparaging comments maybe about it in recent times and over the past decade or two, at the same time, you now realize with COVID, no other agency could have actually mobilized the response that was required to actually deal with it. We're in a similar situation. And that's why government needs to drive social dialogue, and it needs to ensure that the social dialogue produces a social contract that stops the exclusion, it stops the poverty, that ends the inequality that is, and the deprivation that is dividing our society so deeply. Now, I take the point that you may not ever be in a position where you could eliminate everything, all poverty and all deprivation, but you can do a heck of a lot better than we're doing at the moment. And we could do that, but to do it, we need a vision of where we want to go that people can sign off on and that people can agree on. They mightn't agree on everything, but they will agree, yes, that direction is the one we want to go on. That's what the social contract does, an agreement on that. But to achieve that, you need a social dialogue with all viewpoints engaged, competing, as was mentioned earlier, on a level basis, on an equal basis, and working, sharing all the evidence and all the experience that's there. Try to work out a pathway towards that type of future where there would be a huge reduction in inequality, in poverty, in deprivation, in exclusion. They're the kinds of things that can be done, can be delivered. And I would suggest respectfully that the time to do it is now.
Thanks, Sean. So just a reminder for anyone before we wrap up now, because I'm conscious it is 2:10. If anybody does have any other questions, put them either in the Q&A or the chat function. There's a comment there from Alex again, I suppose, making the point that we shouldn't worry too much about income loss from fossil fuel taxation, because we should also welcome that we'll no longer have to find the money to pay for those fuels either. I suppose that is the flip side of that. There's benefits to that, but you have to make sure you support those communities, regions and people who are going to be most impacted, and particularly those who are most vulnerable who will be particularly impacted there. Sean, you might just answer one question for me before we go. You said at the beginning that lessons had been learned since 2008, and this time around government didn't make the choice between society and economy. It was able to protect both. And so how can we build on that? How can we build on the experience of the past 12 months and make sure we don't get back to a space in 12 months' time that we're talking about reducing the deficit, but we're actually looking at how we might implement real change?
I suppose that the first piece in that, Michelle, the first part of it is that we have to recognise that what we did a dozen years ago was the wrong option. Now, the IMF believes it's the wrong option. Others, most of the major economists in the world, believe that the wrong options were taken at that time. Austerity is not the solution. Austerity caused huge damage It caused in Ireland hundreds of thousands of people to lose their jobs unnecessarily. If now, just to make a point, we were making this point. Social Justice Ireland was making this point 10 years ago when the thing was happening. It's not. This isn't all retrospective kind of analysis that we're talking about now. But what we were saying at the time was actually valid. Now, what happened this time is, when pandemic hit, is governments did not make that mistake again. What they did was they borrowed substantially, they organized at European level and in other contexts, and other countries as well, not like the United States and Britain and so on, outside the EU, they were organizing as well. And the result was that countries faced up to the fact that they had to put society and the economy ahead of austerity and balancing the books. Now, how to deal with that? From day one of the pandemic, we have, in the first week or two after it was actually had arrived back in March last, we issued a statement and we put out some analysis to show that what should be done was that that there was going to be very substantial debt associated with the COVID reality over the next few years. All of that debt, COVID-related debt, should be warehoused for all of the EU countries, for example, together. And that should be warehoused in Brussels and follow the process that had been, think of it as going on a war footing. And most people don't realize that Britain paid back the last of its borrowing for the First World War debt, borrowing to fund the First World War. They paid it back just a few years ago. It took 90 years to pay it back. That's the kind of thing we should be thinking about for COVID-related debt. Warehouse it in Brussels, pay back the interest on a very small amount of capital year by year. And then what we see is we do actually have the capacity to actually proceed. We have lessons to learn about the capacity of government to do stuff. And that doesn't mean that you throw money at it. It means that you obviously get value for money. But also there's a very good publication in the last week from the Oireachtas budget office. And they have shown that the debt that is coming down the line in the next 10 years is not on the scale that is generally thought to be the case. In actual fact, that we will be able to handle the debt. And I think that's very important because the contrasting view is articulated this morning in interviews in newspapers by the chair of the Fiscal Advisory Council, who's basically going on already about what you're talking about coming next year, Michelle, like that we're going to have to be looking back and saying, oh God, we have to pay our way, we have to pay back the debt, we have to cut back. In actual fact, they're showing we can actually handle the debt. And I think that's the way we should proceed. Now, obviously, then we have to use that money wisely. The critical issue is that we have choices at this moment. And as I was saying earlier, like the shape of our future for decades will be decided in the next couple of years. Basically, our decisions on how to exit the pandemic and what we're going to do going forward will actually shape the whole thing or reshape the whole thing, depending on what we actually do. We have the opportunity, and I think we actually will have the resources. We certainly have, I think, capacity and so on. But what we need is a vision, or to put that in place, our social contract, and a process, our social dialogue, and put that into place and drive forward to sort of deal with those major challenges we've failed to deal with over a number of decades. And I think it is doable, and it would be a tremendous achievement for this generation to actually deliver on it. It's there, it can be done. I think that's what we should be doing in the years immediately ahead.
Thanks, Sean. I don't see any other questions coming through in the Q&A and the chat. So Sean, I'll just let you wrap up, but just to let everybody know, you'll get an email with a link to the publication after the webinar, and it will be up on our website as well.
So thanks, Michelle. Just a few words to say a very sincere thank you to the team in Social Justice Ireland, and especially to Michelle, who has put an enormous amount of work into putting all of this together. She's the lead person on the socioeconomic review, but all of us actually contribute, in fairness. One of the things you do in Social Justice Ireland is everybody does everything. But but it's important that we all make our contribution. That's what I think I just wanted to acknowledge, because maybe those of you still with us, and there's quite a number of you still there, you may not realize that this publication that we're launching is actually 420 pages long. We didn't tell you that at the beginning, or you probably have decided we'd be here for a week presenting it. But anyway, 420 pages. As Michelle says, it'll be up on the website for download. You'll get an email about that very soon, in the next very short while. The critical issue from my perspective is to say thanks to the team. It's a wonderful achievement. And just to bear in mind, the whole thing was done working from home. The whole team working from home the whole time, because we've been working from home now for just over a year. And we haven't been back in the office at all. So it's, I think it's been a wonderful achievement. I'm very happy with it. I hope everybody who has spent time with us and that it's been worth your while being with us. We're delighted that you're prepared to spend the time and be with us as we work through the presentation and deal with the questions and so on. And we're very, very happy, obviously, to provide this socioeconomic review for people to read and ponder and so on. One final question, or one final issue. If people are interested in any parts of it, if you have questions, if there's things you need to sort of raise or whatever with us, don't hesitate to send us an email, and you have the email in the email that you get very soon. You can respond to that, and we'll do our best to respond. Obviously, we're a small team, but we'll do the very best we can. So listen, thanks to the team, and thanks to you for being with us the last, what is it, an hour and a quarter, whatever. Okay, thank you very, very much. We'll see you again in the not too distant future, hopefully. Thank you.